you've probably heard the instruction in Chaturanga to make sure that we shift forward onto our toes before we lower so that we can find that 90-degree angle at our elbows. Now, is that alignment rule important? And is that the only way to practice Chaturanga? Well, consider this. If we take a look at plank pose, in plank, if I shift forward onto my toes, I am sending more weight and more load into my upper body, shoulders and arms. And if I instead reach back through my heels and take my weight back, I'm taking some weight off the upper body and instead shifting it more toward the lower body. So with that knowledge in mind, we can start to see that shifting forward onto the toes in Chaturanga actually makes Chaturanga a harder pose for the upper body, which is the part of the body challenged most in Chaturanga anyway. So when I come forward onto the toes and then lower down, my shoulders and upper body have to work more in the pose than they do if I reach back through my heels and then lower like that. So shifting forward is actually a progression and shifting back is a regression. And because many yogis don't actually have the true strength to execute a skillful Chaturanga anyway, they actually may be well served by shifting back and reaching back through the heels so that they can offload the upper body a bit and make the pose a little more accessible. So for that reason, we don't need to look at Chaturanga as the only correct way to practice it is forward onto the toes. There are actually multiple ways to practice it, and they're just variations of each other. And now I know your question may be, well, what about that 90-degree elbow angle? Isn't that important? But it actually turns out that there's nothing special or magical about hitting that 90-degree angle. And that's just an arbitrary aesthetic ideal that we're just layering onto the shape from the outside. And the more that we make our yoga poses about meeting these standards of right angles and straight lines, the less that we're making our poses about things like efficient movement and effective strength building. So I would suggest that instead of layering on top of our poses these aesthetic ideals, we instead just consider the individual body doing the pose, their goals or our goals for them, and then how we may choose to teach the pose based on that. Another factor to consider with the Chaturanga variations is which muscles are working more in each variation. So we should know that when we reach back through the heels and lower, our triceps are actually working more in that variation. And when we shift forward onto the toes and lower, our anterior deltoids are actually working more in that variation. So both of those muscles are working in both, but the ratio changes depending on the elbow angle and the way that we position ourselves. So if someone happens to have muscle-specific goals for that movement, like they want to target the triceps or target the anterior deltoid, they might want to choose a different variation based on that. Last thing to consider for this issue is when we shift forward onto the toes, the wrists will come into more wrist extension. So shifting forward brings the wrist more into like 90 degrees of extension, and shifting back requires less wrist extension. And that can matter for someone for whom their wrist joints may be sensitive when bearing load at that 90-degree angle. So someone with that specific issue may benefit from shifting back anyway and not doing the shifted forward variation. So with all of that said, hopefully we can see that we can start to look at Chaturanga as being less about right angles and straight lines, because there are no right angles or straight lines in the human body anyway. And instead we can make the way we approach the pose be more about just finding efficient movement and effective strength building.